If you ever find a single drop of water in a dead world, you don't waste it. You survive with it, or you die without it. The wind dragged across the glass desert like a dull blade, whispering over cracked earth that had once been oceans, and Hale could taste the dryness in his teeth, metallic, bitter, like breathing dust through a rusted filter as his boots sank half an inch in a sand fused by old heat, his suit reading 118 degrees Fahrenheit outside and climbing. The war wasn't loud anymore out here, not where he walked alone. Just the distant hum of machines far beyond the horizon and the slow, relentless pull of thirst tightening his throat until even swallowing felt like friction against bone. He stopped, lifted his canteen, and tilted it, watching the inside like it might change its mind, but it didn't. Just one last drop clung stubbornly to the rim, trembling with each shallow breath he took. And for a moment, that drop was everything: weight, value, time itself measured in ounces and seconds. Then something shifted in the distance, not movement exactly, more like the heat shimmer. Bending wrong, and Lucas narrowed his eyes, visor flickering as it tried to focus through distortion, until the shape resolved into a figure half buried against the dune. Too still to be safe, too precise to be debris. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, instincts sharpened not by danger, but by exhaustion, and when he crouched, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. She wasn't human. That was clear even before her eyes opened. Skin a deep, luminous blue like twilight caught under glass, faint patterns beneath it pulsing weakly, as if light itself were struggling to move through her. And when her gaze met his, it wasn't fear he saw, not exactly. It was distance, like she had already stepped halfway out of this world. Her lips parted, barely, and the word that came out didn't need translation, didn't need context, didn't even need strength. It just existed between them, fragile and undeniable. Water. Lucas exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the canteen as if it might anchor him to something rational, something simple, because this wasn't complicated. Not really. It was math, survival reduced to its most honest equation. One drop, one life. And his body already knew which side it was on, every cell pulling inward, conserving, holding, refusing. But her eyes didn't move, didn't beg, didn't demand. They just watched him like the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this moment. The wind shifted again, brushing sand across his boots, across her shoulder, across the thin line between choice and consequence, and Lucas swallowed hard, feeling nothing go down, then slowly lifted the canteen and turned it over, letting gravity make the decision he couldn't quite justify. The drop fell, catching a sliver of harsh sunlight before landing on her lips, and for a second, nothing happened at all. Then her skin flickered, faint but real, like a signal finding its way back through static, and Lucas closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, not in regret, just in acknowledgement, because he knew exactly what he had traded and out. Here, in a world that had forgotten mercy, that was the only thing that still made him human. The first thing Lucas noticed was the sound, not from the sky or the distant machines, but from her, a faint, irregular rhythm like liquid trying to remember how to move through something that had almost stopped. And when he opened his eyes again, the blue beneath her skin was no longer dim but shifting, subtle currents of light threading through her arms and neck, as if that single drop had woken something deeper than thirst. His own throat tightened immediately in response, dry to the point of pain, and he swallowed out of habit even though there was nothing left to give his body, nothing left to trade. And the realization settled in quietly, not dramatic, not sudden, just there, like the heat pressing against his suit, like the slow drift of sand against his boots. He had crossed a line, and there was no stepping back. She inhaled sharply, a fuller breath this time, and her eyes focused on him with a clarity that had not been there before, studying him not as an enemy, not even as a stranger, but as something she could not immediately define. And when she spoke again, her voice carried more weight, still soft but no longer fading. You should not have done that. And Lucas let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if he had the energy for it, shaking his head once as he leaned back onto his heels. Yeah. Well, he said, his voice rough, each word scraping on the way out. I am not great at making smart decisions. And for a moment, the corner of her expression shifted, Not quite a smile, but something close. Something that did not belong in a place like this. The wind picked up again, dragging a thin veil of sand across the ground, and Lucas glanced toward the horizon out of instinct, measuring distance, direction, anything that might still matter. But the world felt smaller now, narrowed down to the space between them and the fragile balance holding him upright. His suit chimed softly, a warning he did not need to read. Hydration levels critical, core temperature rising. Projected survival window shortening by the minute, and he reached up to silence it. Without looking, as if ignoring it could buy him time, as if time was still something he owned. When he looked back at her, she was watching his hand, the motion, the control, the way he chose to dismiss his own condition, and there was something in her gaze now that had not been there before, not superiority, not suspicion, something quieter, something closer to understanding. Your body, she said slowly, as if translating the concept rather than the words. It is failing. And Lucas shrugged. Faintly, the movement costing more than it should. It has been doing that for a while, he replied, then nodded toward her. You are looking a lot better, though. And that was true. The faint luminescence beneath her skin had strengthened, patterns becoming more defined, like circuits coming back online, like a system rebooting after near shutdown, and she shifted slightly, testing movement, her hand pressing into the sand, fingers flexing with growing strength, and when she pushed herself up, just a few inches, the air around her seemed to ripple, not heat, not wind, something else, something Lucas could not quite name. He noticed it, even through the haze creeping into the edges of his vision. The way the space near her hand felt cooler, denser, like moisture gathering where there should have been none, and for a brief second, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, if dehydration had already started bending reality into something easier to accept. She followed his gaze, then looked back at him, her expression sharpening with a realization that seemed to arrive all at once, and when she spoke next, it was no longer a question, no longer uncertainty, but something closer to awe. You gave me more than water, she said quietly, and Lucas blinked slowly, trying to focus, trying to stay present as the world tilted just slightly off-center. Pretty sure it was just water, he murmured, but even as he said it, he was not entirely convinced anymore, because the air around them felt different now, heavier in a way that did not suffocate, cooler in a way that did not come from shade, and somewhere beneath the sound of the wind, beneath the distant hum of a war that no longer seemed as immediate, there was a new rhythm forming, steady, rising, like something vast beginning to wake. Lucas could feel the moment his body began to slip, not like falling, not sudden, but like something loosening its grip from the inside, each breath shallower than the last as the heat pressed closer, heavier, until even the air felt thick and reluctant to move through his lungs, and yet the space around her remained different, cooler by a few degrees his suit could not explain. Moisture clinging faintly to the inside of his visor where there should have been nothing but dry circulation. He blinked hard, trying to clear the blur forming at the edges of his vision, focusing on her as she pushed herself further upright. The movement steady now, controlled, her posture no longer that of someone barely holding on, but of someone remembering strength she had never truly lost. The patterns beneath her blue skin brightened in slow pulses, each one synchronized with that strange, quiet rhythm in the air. And when her hand pressed fully into the sand this time, Lucas saw it clearly, grains around her fingers darkening, clumping, as if drawing in something unseen, as if the desert itself was beginning to breathe again. That is not possible, he murmured, though he did not know if he meant her or the world shifting around them. And she turned her gaze toward the ground, studying the change with an intensity that felt almost reverent, then back to him, her voice steadier now, carrying a tone that no longer belonged to survival but to recognition. It is not the water alone, she said, each word deliberate. It is the giving. And Lucas let out a faint breath that might have been disbelief, shaking his head slightly as he leaned back against the slope of the dune, the effort costing him more than he wanted to admit. You are telling me, he said slowly, forcing the words through a throat that felt like cracked stone. That one drop did all this, and she tilted her head, as if considering how to translate something far larger into terms he could understand. For my kind, she replied. Water is not only survival. It is connection. It carries memory, energy, continuity. And when it is given freely, without exchange, it amplifies. She paused, her eyes softening in a way that felt almost human. You did not just sustain me. You awakened what I am. And Lucas stared at her, trying to process the weight of that. But the world tilted again, sharper this time, the horizon bending as his body reminded him of its limits. His hand pressing into the sand to steady himself as his fingers trembled with weakness. She noticed immediately the shift in his balance, the strain in his breath, and her expression changed, not to alarm, but to something deeper, something that carried responsibility. And she moved closer, not quickly, not aggressively, but with purpose, kneeling in front of him as the faint coolness around her intensified, the air thickening with that same invisible presence that had begun to reshape the ground. Lucas exhaled slowly, his eyes struggling to stay open. If you are about to tell me you can fix this, he muttered, voice barely above a whisper, you might want to hurry. And for the first time, she did not respond with words, instead lifting her hand, hovering it just inches from his chest, not touching, but close enough that he could feel it, a subtle pressure, like standing near a source of unseen current, and the space between them seemed to gather, condense, until a faint shimmer formed, almost imperceptible at first, then clearer, a bead of liquid suspended in the air where there had been nothing before. Lucas stared at it, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew, and she watched him, not with pride, not with superiority, but with a quiet certainty that made the impossible feel inevitable. You gave when you had nothing, she said softly. Now you will learn what that means. And the droplet grew, slowly, impossibly, pulling from a world that had long forgotten how to give anything back. The droplet hung there between them, trembling in the heated air like it did not belong to this world. And Lucas could not look away, his vision narrowing to that single point of impossible clarity as his body struggled to stay upright, every instinct telling him to reach for it, to take it, to survive. Yet something in him hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of disbelief that this was real. The air around her hand pulsed softly, a low, steady rhythm that matched the glow beneath her skin, and the bead of water grew just enough to catch the light, reflecting fractured pieces of the sky, of him, of her, like it carried more than just liquid inside it. Go on, she said quietly, her voice calm, certain, as if this moment had already been written long before he arrived in this desert. And Lucas let out a weak breath, his lips parting as he leaned forward, the movement slow, heavy, as though gravity itself had increased. And when the droplet finally touched his mouth, it did not fall. Like ordinary water, it seemed to press into him, cool and immediate, spreading across his tongue with a clarity that felt almost electric, not just easing the dryness, but cutting through it, restoring something deeper than thirst. His eyes closed instinctively, not from relief alone, but from the sudden contrast, the shift from emptiness to presence. And for a brief second, the world steadied. When he opened them again, the desert no longer felt entirely dead, the air still harsh, the ground still fractured, but something subtle had changed, a thin layer of moisture clinging to the edges of his awareness, as if the planet itself was beginning to remember what it had lost. He inhaled slowly, deeper this time, the breath filling his lungs without that scraping resistance, and his hand, still pressed into the sand, felt something new beneath his fingers, not heat, not dust, but a faint coolness, like the promise of something buried just below the surface. He pulled his hand back slightly, staring at the grains that now held together, darker than before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucas let out a quiet exhale, shaking his head in disbelief. That is not normal, he said, his voice steadier now, though still rough at the edges, and she watched him carefully, her gaze no longer distant, no longer guarded, but focused, almost intent. No, she agreed softly, it is not. And there was something in the way she said it that carried more weight than the words themselves, something that hinted at scale, at consequence, at a reach far beyond this small stretch of desert. Lucas pushed himself up slightly, testing his balance, and this time his body responded, not fully recovered, not strong, but no longer on the edge of collapse. And he glanced at her again, studying the way the light beneath her skin moved with purpose now, the way the air around her continued to shift, subtle currents forming and dissolving as if guided by something unseen. "You said I awakened something," he muttered, still trying to piece together what that meant, and she nodded once, slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You did," she said, "but not only in me." And before he could ask what she meant, the sky above them changed, not with sound, not with force, but with presence, a shadow passing high overhead, vast and deliberate, casting a moving shade across the desert that did not come from clouds. Lucas looked up instinctively, his eyes narrowing against the glare, and for a moment, all he could see was the distortion, the bending of light around something enormous, something just beyond clear sight, and his breath caught, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever had begun here, whatever had been set in motion by a single drop freely given, was no longer contained to just the two of them. The shadow did not pass like a cloud. It lingered, vast and deliberate, bending the sunlight into fractured angles across the desert as Lucas stood there, breathing slower now, steadier, his body no longer on the brink, but not yet whole, caught between exhaustion and something newly restored. And he felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, not just around her this time, but spreading outward, a quiet expansion like a ripple moving across still water. He tilted his head back, squinting into the glare, trying to define the shape above them. But it refused to settle into anything familiar, more absence than object, something so large it distorted perception itself. And for the first time since the war had driven him out here, Lucas felt something other than survival pressing at the edges of his mind, something closer to awe. "That is yours," he said slowly, not quite a question, his voice carrying a rough edge that had not fully faded, and she followed his gaze upward, her expression calm, almost knowing. "Not mine," she replied, her tone quiet but firm. "Ours." And that single word landed heavier than anything else she had said, because it did not separate him from it, did not place him beneath it. It included him in something he had never asked to be part of. The wind shifted again, but it no longer felt as empty, carrying with it a faint trace of coolness that brushed against his face like memory rather than sensation, and Lucas glanced back down at the ground, noticing how the sand near them had changed, small patches darkened, holding shape instead of slipping away, as if the desert was slowly remembering how to hold water instead of reject it. He crouched slightly, pressing his fingers into it again, and this time the resistance was unmistakable, a fragile cohesion that should not exist here, and he let out a low breath, something between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. "You are changing this place," he said, and she shook her head gently, stepping closer, her presence steady, grounded. "No," she answered, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that carried no doubt. "You are." And Lucas blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in her voice. "I gave you one drop," he said, almost defensively, as if reducing it could make sense of it, and she nodded once, acknowledging the truth without diminishing it. "Yes," she said, "and that is why it matters." And before he could respond, the air shifted again, stronger this time. Not just a presence above, but movement within it, a low vibration that resonated through the ground beneath his boots, subtle but undeniable, like something responding, something aware. Lucas straightened slowly, his body still adjusting to the fragile balance between weakness and recovery, and he looked back at her, searching for explanation, for limits, for anything that could anchor this moment to reality as he understood it. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter, more measured, and she held his gaze for a long second before answering, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a calm that felt almost inevitable. "Now," she said softly, "they come." And as if the words themselves carried weight, the sky above them shifted again, the vast distortion resolving just enough for Lucas to see outlines forming, multiple shapes, descending not with speed, not with force, but with intention, and the light across the desert dimmed slightly as their shadows stretched outward, covering more ground. Reaching farther than before, Lucas exhaled slowly, his heart steady but aware, not racing, not panicking, just present, And he realized in that moment that whatever this was, whatever had begun with a single choice made in silence and heat and exhaustion, it had already moved beyond him, beyond survival, beyond war, into something that did not measure value in strength or territory, but in something far quieter, far more dangerous in its simplicity. The willingness to give when there was nothing left to give. They did not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrived with silence, a controlled descent that pressed gently against the air rather than tearing through it. And Lucas felt it before he fully saw it, a shift in pressure that settled across his shoulders. Like the weight of something ancient and patient, the shapes above resolved further, no longer just distortions but defined forms, smooth and vast, their surfaces reflecting the harsh sunlight in muted tones that seemed to absorb brightness instead of casting it back. And as they lowered, the desert responded, not violently, not chaotically, but with a quiet adjustment, grains of sand settling. The faint patches of darkened ground spreading outward inch by inch as if drawn toward their presence. Lucas stood still, not because he did not know what to do, but because there was nothing left to do that would change what was happening. His breathing steady now, his body no longer failing but still fragile, caught in the aftermath of a choice that had expanded beyond him. Beside him, she did not move away, did not retreat. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, her posture straightening with a calm authority that had not been visible before. The light beneath her blue skin now flowing in. Clear, deliberate patterns, each pulse synchronized with the subtle vibration in the air, and Lucas realized that whatever these things were, they were not strangers to her. "Friends of yours," he muttered, his voice low, not mocking, not afraid, just trying to place himself in a situation that no longer followed any rules he understood. And she glanced at him briefly, something like a faint smile touching her expression before fading back into focus. "They are not friends," she said softly. "They are witnesses." And that word lingered, heavier than he expected, carrying implications he could not fully grasp. The nearest of the descending forms slowed as it approached the ground, stopping just above the surface, its presence casting a wide, cool shadow that stretched over both of them. And for a moment, Lucas felt the temperature drop noticeably, the relentless heat easing just enough to feel like relief rather than survival. And within that shadow, the air grew denser, thicker with that same unseen moisture he had felt earlier. Only now it was stronger, undeniable, like standing near the edge of a body of water that had not yet taken shape. He inhaled slowly, deeper than before, and the breath did not burn, did not scrape. It settled into his lungs with a steadiness that felt almost foreign after everything he had endured. The surface of the craft, if it could be called that, shifted subtly, not opening, not breaking apart, but adjusting, forming a smooth curvature that angled downward toward them. And within that curve, Lucas caught a glimpse of movement, not figures, not shapes he could define, but presence, awareness directed entirely at the two of them. He felt it then, not as a threat, not as fear, but as attention, focused and precise, like being studied not for weakness, but for meaning. He glanced at her again, searching for confirmation, for guidance, anything that might explain why he was still standing here instead of running. And she met his gaze with the same calm certainty. "They felt it," she said quietly. "The moment you gave without expectation, it resonated beyond this world." And Lucas let out a slow breath, the words settling into him with a strange kind of weight, not overwhelming, just undeniable. "So they came all this way," he said, glancing back up at the massive form hovering above them, "for a single drop of water." And she shook her head gently, stepping closer until the faint coolness around her blended fully with the shadow cast by the descending presence. "Not for the water," she replied, her voice steady, almost reverent, "for the choice." And as if the word itself completed something, the air between them and the hovering form shifted again, the moisture thickening, condensing, and for the first time since Lucas had set foot on this dead world, a single, soft sound broke the silence, the unmistakable, fragile echo of a drop forming where there had been none. The sound of that forming drop did not stop at one. It echoed, soft at first, then repeating, irregular but growing, as if the air itself was learning how to remember something it had forgotten for too long. And Lucas stood there under the immense shadow, feeling it, not just hearing it. A faint vibration that moved through the ground and up into his legs, into his chest, settling somewhere deeper than thought. He looked down and saw it happen, not all at once, not dramatically, but undeniably, small beads of moisture appearing across the darkened patches of sand, clinging to the surface before sinking in, leaving behind a texture that held, that resisted the endless shifting that had defined this place for so long. His breath caught, not from fear, not from strain, but from recognition, because this was no longer just survival. This was change, slow and quiet but real. Beside him, she closed her eyes for a moment, her expression still, almost listening, and the light beneath her skin intensified, flowing in smoother patterns now, no longer flickering, but steady, controlled. And when she opened her eyes again, they reflected the faint shimmer in the air, carrying something vast within them, something that made Lucas feel, for the first time, small in a way that did not diminish him, but placed him within something larger. "They are responding," she said softly, her voice blending with the rhythm of the forming droplets, and Lucas let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly as he watched the ground continue to change. "To what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, already felt it settling into him with each passing second, and she turned to him fully now, her presence no longer that of someone recovering, but someone awakening. "To you," she said simply, and the word did not carry praise, did not elevate him. It just stated a fact that the world around them was beginning to confirm. The massive form above shifted again, lowering slightly, and this time Lucas could see more clearly, not details, not structure in the way he understood machines, but layers, surfaces that moved with purpose, adjusting to something unseen, and within that movement, the air thickened further, the faint moisture gathering into something more substantial, droplets forming faster now, larger, some falling and disappearing into the sand, others lingering just long enough to catch the light before joining the ground. Lucas raised a hand instinctively, feeling one land against his skin, cool and real, and he stared at it for a second before letting out a quiet, disbelieving breath. "Rain," he murmured, the word foreign on. This world, almost absurd, and yet there it was, fragile and tentative, but undeniable. She watched him, not with curiosity now, but with understanding, as if this moment mattered more to him than to her, as if she knew what it meant for a place like this to feel water again, and she stepped closer, her voice lowering slightly, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for what was unfolding. "Not yet," she said gently. "This is only the beginning." And Lucas nodded faintly, his gaze still fixed on the ground, on the way the sand no longer rejected what touched it, on the way it held, absorbed, changed, and he realized then that whatever this process was, it was not sudden, not overwhelming, it was deliberate, measured, as if something vast had decided to rebuild this world one drop at a time. The shadow above deepened slightly as more of the descending forms aligned, their presence overlapping, amplifying the shift in the air, and the rhythm of the droplets grew steadier, no longer scattered, but forming a pattern, a slow, consistent fall that began to connect the patches of darkened ground into something larger. Lucas looked up again, his eyes tracing the outlines of the massive shapes, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was being watched from above. He felt like he was standing at the center of something unfolding, something that had chosen this moment, this place, this single act, as its starting point, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, as the first true drops of rain began to find their way back to a world that had forgotten how to receive them. The rain did not rush, it arrived with patience, each drop spaced just far enough apart to be noticed, to be counted, to matter, and Lucas stood there with his hands still raised, feeling them land one by one against his skin, cool and deliberate, as if the sky itself was learning restraint after a long silence. The ground responded in kind, not flooding, not shifting violently, but absorbing, holding, darkening in widening circles that began to connect into something larger than isolated patches, and for the first time since he had set foot on this world, the desert did not feel endless. It felt like something waiting. He lowered his hand slowly, watching the moisture gather along the lines of his glove before slipping down and disappearing into the sand. And there was a strange weight in that simple motion, a realization settling deeper with each passing second that this was not an accident, not a temporary anomaly, but a beginning measured in quiet persistence. Beside him, she remained still, her presence aligned with the rhythm of the falling droplets, the glow beneath her. Blue skin steady and controlled, no longer flickering with recovery, but flowing with intention. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same calm certainty that had followed her since the moment she stood. "Your world measures change in force," she said softly, her eyes tracing the spreading darkness across the sand. "Ours measures it in continuity." And Lucas let out a slow breath, glancing from the sky to the ground, to her, trying to place himself within that difference. "Back home," he replied, his voice quieter now, less strained. "Change usually comes with noise," and she tilted her head slightly, considering that noise is not required for meaning. She answered, and the simplicity of it settled between them like the rain itself, gentle but impossible to ignore. Above them, the massive forms shifted again, not descending further now, but stabilizing, holding position as if their role was no longer to arrive, but to sustain, and the shadow they cast softened at the edges, allowing thin lines of sunlight to break through, scattering across the falling droplets and turning them briefly into flashes of light before they vanished into the ground. Lucas watched it happen, the way the light caught each drop, the way it transformed something simple into something almost unreal, and he felt that same quiet shift inside himself, the tension that had driven him through days of survival easing just enough to make room for something else, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He crouched again, slower this time, more controlled, and pressed his hand into the dampened sand, feeling the difference more clearly now, the way it held shape, the way it resisted collapse. And when he lifted his hand, the imprint remained for a second longer than it should have, a small, fragile mark in a place that had never allowed anything to last. He stared at it, then let out a faint breath, almost a laugh but softer, less certain. "It is actually working," he said, not to her, not to the sky, just to the moment itself, and she stepped closer, her gaze following his. "It was always going to," she replied, her tone steady, not proud, not surprised, just acknowledging what had already begun. The rain grew slightly more consistent now, still gentle, still controlled, but no longer hesitant, and the sound it made against the ground formed a quiet pattern, a rhythm that filled the space where silence had once dominated. And Lucas closed his eyes for a brief second, letting it settle around him. The coolness, the sound, the presence, all of it layering into something that felt almost like memory, even though he had never experienced it here before. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at her, really looked this time, not as someone he had saved, not as someone different, but as part of this moment, and he realized that whatever came next, whatever these witnesses above chose to do, whatever this world became, it had already been decided in the smallest possible way, in a single act that had asked for nothing in return, and the rain continued to fall, not as a storm, not as a spectacle, but as proof that even the quietest choices could reshape something far larger than the person who made them. The rain settled into a rhythm that no longer felt fragile, each drop landing with quiet certainty, building upon the last until the sound itself became a presence, steady and grounding. And Lucas stood there letting it touch his face, his shoulders, his hands, not moving, not speaking, as if any interruption might break whatever delicate balance had formed. The desert beneath his boots had changed enough now that he could feel it without looking, the surface no longer shifting with every step, but holding, resisting, carrying weight in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, and he realized he had stopped thinking about survival, not because the danger was gone, but because something else had taken its place, something that did not demand urgency but awareness. He opened his eyes slowly and looked out across the landscape, watching as the darkened patches expanded outward, connecting into wider stretches of damp ground that reflected faint traces of light, subtle and uneven but growing. And in that reflection, he saw the sky above not as an empty expanse, but as something active, layered with the presence of those massive forms that remained suspended, unmoving, yet undeniably involved in what was happening below. Beside him, she walked a few steps forward, her movements calm and measured, each step leaving a faint imprint in the softened ground. and Lucas followed her with his gaze, noticing how the air around her still carried that slight distortion, not heat, not wind, but something denser, something that shaped the space itself. She knelt slowly, placing her hand flat against the damp sand, and for a moment nothing changed. Then the patterns beneath her skin brightened, flowing outward in a controlled pulse that spread from her palm into the ground, and Lucas watched as the moisture there gathered more quickly, droplets forming and sinking, reinforcing the change in a way that felt deliberate, guided. "You are directing it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and she glanced back at him briefly, her expression calm. "I am listening," she replied, "and it is responding." And Lucas let that settle, the idea that this was not force, not control, but something closer to communication, something that required presence rather than power. He stepped closer, crouching again beside her, his movements steadier now, though still careful, and he placed his hand near hers, not touching, just close enough to feel the difference, the coolness, the subtle vibration that moved through the ground like a slow, steady pulse. For a moment he did nothing, just observed, just breathed, and then, almost without thinking, he pressed his hand into the damp sand, mirroring her earlier movement, and he felt it immediately. Not a surge, not a dramatic shift, but a slight response, a faint gathering of moisture beneath his fingers that had not been there a second before. He pulled his hand back slightly, staring at it, then at the ground, his brow furrowing in quiet disbelief. "That is new," he murmured, and she nodded once, her gaze steady. "You are part of it now," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just a simple acknowledgement of what had already become true. Lucas exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and looked out again across the expanding patches of life returning to the surface, the rain continuing its measured fall, the sky above holding its silent witnesses, and he realized that whatever this was, whatever had begun with a single choice made in isolation, it was no longer something he had done, it was something he had joined, something that extended beyond him in ways he could not fully understand yet. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying with it the faint scent of something unfamiliar, not dust, not heat, but something closer to freshness, subtle but undeniable, and Lucas closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting it settle into him, not as relief, not as victory, but as a quiet shift in a world that had chosen, finally, to respond. The rain continued without urgency, steady enough now that Lucas could hear the difference between each surface it touched, the softened sand, the edges of his suit, the faint metallic hum of his gear adjusting to conditions it had not been designed to recognize, and he stood there with his hands still near the ground, feeling the subtle response beneath his fingertips as if the planet itself had begun to answer in a language he was only starting to understand. He lifted his gaze slowly, scanning the horizon where the once endless desert now carried texture, variation, faint lines of darker soil stretching outward like veins beginning to form beneath the surface. And the sight held him longer than he expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, incremental, undeniable. Behind him, the low hum of his suit shifted, a soft recalibration as its sensors adjusted to rising humidity. The internal display flickering briefly before stabilizing, and for the first time since he had stepped onto this world, the numbers did not read like a countdown. They read like a change in direction. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and glanced at her again, watching the way she moved through this moment not as a survivor, not as someone reacting, but as someone aligned with it, her posture relaxed yet purposeful, her presence integrated into the rhythm of the falling water. "This is bigger than you thought," he said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just acknowledging the scale that had revealed itself. And she turned her head slightly, her eyes reflecting the soft light scattering through the rain. "It is not about scale," she replied, her voice calm. "It is about continuity." And Lucas let that sit for a second, then nodded faintly, understanding not the full meaning, but the direction of it. The massive forms above shifted again, not descending further, not advancing, but adjusting their alignment in a way that felt almost deliberate, like positioning rather than arrival. And as they did, the pattern of the rain changed subtly, no longer scattered across the ground but guided into thin, widening paths that traced the contours of the terrain, filling shallow depressions, connecting them, shaping the flow without force. Lucas watched it happen, his brow tightening slightly as he followed the movement, recognizing something familiar in the way the water chose its direction, not random, not chaotic, but efficient, purposeful, like it knew where it needed to go. He stepped forward, careful but more stable now, and crouched again near one of the forming lines, watching as the water gathered, slowed, then moved again, carving a faint channel into the softened ground, and he reached out, touching it lightly, feeling the coolness run against his glove, the motion steady and controlled. "You are guiding it," he said, this time more certain, and she shook her head gently, stepping closer, her gaze following the same line of movement. "No," she answered softly, "it is." Remembering, and Lucas paused, his hand still near the forming stream, the words settling into him with a weight that felt different from everything else, not new, not foreign, but deeply familiar in a way he could not immediately place. He looked up again, following the line outward, watching how it connected to another, then another, small networks forming where there had been none, and he realized that this was not just change, this was restoration, something returning rather than something being created. He stood slowly, turning in place to take in more of the landscape, the subtle shifts, the growing coherence in what had once been nothing but scattered dryness, and for a moment, he felt it clearly. The scale of it, not overwhelming, not distant, but present, unfolding in real time around him. Beside him, she remained quiet, her attention focused not on the sky now, but on the ground, on the way each drop contributed, each connection formed, and Lucas followed her gaze, letting his own settle there as well, and he understood then, not completely, but enough, that whatever had begun here was not meant to happen all at once. It was meant to build, to continue, to carry forward beyond this moment. The rain fell, steady and deliberate, and the ground answered, not with resistance, but with acceptance, and Lucas stood within it, no longer just a witness, no longer just a cause, but something in between, something that had chosen once, and now had to decide what that choice meant going forward. Lucas stood at the edge of one of the forming channels, watching the thin stream of water trace its path through the once lifeless ground, and for a moment, he did not move, not because he could not, but because he understood that any movement now carried weight, not physical weight, but meaning, and that realization settled into him deeper than the exhaustion that had once defined every step he took. The rain continued, steady and measured, each drop contributing to something that no longer felt fragile, and he could hear the difference in it now, the subtle variation in sound as water met water, as shallow lines began to merge into something wider, more cohesive, and the desert that had once stretched endlessly now carried direction, purpose, a quiet structure forming beneath his feet. He looked up again at the massive forms above, their presence unchanged yet undeniably active, their alignment holding steady as if maintaining a balance that required no visible effort, and he realized that whatever they were doing, they were not forcing this transformation, they were sustaining it, allowing it to unfold rather than commanding it into existence. Beside him, she stepped forward again, her movements smooth, her attention fixed on the ground rather than the sky, and Lucas followed her gaze, noticing how the water responded more quickly now where she walked, not dramatically, not unnaturally, but with a slight increase in flow, a subtle reinforcement that suggested connection rather than control. "It is accelerating," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and she nodded once, her expression calm. "It is stabilizing," she corrected gently, and Lucas exhaled slowly, accepting the difference, understanding that this was not about speed, not about rushing toward an end, but about ensuring that what began would continue. He crouched again, this time, without hesitation, placing his hand fully into the shallow stream, feeling the water move around his fingers, cool and steady, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, but to feel it more clearly, the motion, the presence, the quiet persistence of something that did not demand attention, yet transformed everything it touched. When he opened his eyes again, he saw it more clearly, not just the water, not just the ground, but the pattern forming between them, the way each small change connected to another. The way the landscape was reshaping itself through continuity rather than force. He pulled his hand back slowly, watching the water continue its path without interruption, and he realized that his role in this moment was not to direct, not to intervene, but to understand, to remain present within it. She turned to him then, her gaze steady, carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed her since the moment she stood. "You feel it now," she said, not asking, not confirming, simply stating, and Lucas nodded once, his voice softer than before. "Yeah," he replied, glancing back at the flowing lines of water. "I do." And there was no hesitation in his tone, no doubt, just recognition. The rain fell around them. The sky held its silent watchers, and the ground continued to answer, not with resistance, not with chaos, but with acceptance, and Lucas stood there within it, no longer separate from the change, no longer observing from the outside, but existing within the same continuity that was reshaping the world around him, understanding now that the choice he had made was not an isolated act, but the beginning of something that would continue long after this moment passed, long after he left this place, because what had been given freely could not be undone, it could only grow. The water no longer hesitated as it moved. It followed its path with quiet certainty, widening in places where the ground allowed it, narrowing where resistance remained, but always continuing, always connecting, and Lucas stood there watching it not as something separate from himself, but as something he had become part of, something that carried his choice forward in ways he could not control and did not need to. The rain above maintained its steady rhythm, each drop landing with intention, not random, not wasteful, but precise, guided by something vast yet gentle, and the massive forms overhead remained in their silent alignment, their presence no longer overwhelming, but stabilizing, like pillars holding open a space where change could happen without collapse. Lucas turned slowly, taking in the expanding network of shallow streams that now traced the landscape. The darkened ground no longer isolated patches but continuous stretches, and for the first time, he could see distance differently, not as empty space to cross, but as terrain that could sustain, that could hold, that could grow. Beside him, she moved again, but this time there was a shift in her posture, a subtle preparation, as if something within her had reached a point of completion, and Lucas noticed it immediately. The way the light beneath her skin changed, not brighter, not stronger, but more focused, gathering inward instead of flowing outward. "Something is changing," he said quietly, his voice steady. And she looked at him with a calm that carried both understanding and finality. "Yes," she replied, "this phase is ending." And the word phase settled into him with a weight he did not fully understand, but he felt the truth of it in the air, in the ground, in the rhythm of the rain that had begun to shift again, not stopping, not fading, but stabilizing into a pattern that no longer required constant reinforcement. Lucas glanced upward, noticing how the massive forms had begun to adjust once more, not descending, not advancing, but slowly pulling back, their alignment loosening, just enough to suggest departure rather than arrival. And the shadow they cast softened further, allowing more light to filter through, illuminating the growing network of water below. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, and looked back at her. "They are leaving," he said, not as a question, and she nodded once. "They came to witness," she answered, "and to ensure continuity." And Lucas let that settle. The idea that this moment, this transformation, had been observed, acknowledged, and now left to continue on its own. He stepped closer to one of the streams, crouching again, his movements deliberate, and he placed his hand into the water once more, feeling its steady flow, the coolness that no longer felt fragile but established, and he realized that it would continue whether he stood here or walked away, whether he understood it or not. He pulled his hand back and stood, turning toward her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the rain continuing around them, the ground answering, the sky shifting as the vast forms began their slow retreat. "What about you?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but clear, and she held his gaze, the light beneath her skin now calm, contained, no longer spreading outward. "I remain until balance is secured," she said, and there was no uncertainty in her tone, no hesitation, just a simple statement of purpose. Lucas nodded once, accepting it without question, and looked out across the landscape again, watching the water move, the ground hold, the sky open, and he understood then that whatever this place became, whatever it grew into, it would not need constant intervention, it would not need force, it would need continuity. The same quiet persistence that had begun it. The rain fell, the streams flowed, and the world, once still and unyielding, now moved forward on its own, carrying the echo of a single choice into something far greater than the moment it was made. The sky cleared without ceremony, the massive forms receding until they were no longer shapes but memory, their presence dissolving into the vast blue above, and Lucas stood there long after they were gone, listening not for their return, but for what remained. The rain had softened now, not ending, just settling into something sustainable, a gentle, consistent fall that no longer demanded attention. And the ground beneath his boots held firm, dark and alive in a way that felt almost impossible to reconcile with the barren wasteland he had crossed not long ago. He took a slow breath, deeper than any he had taken since arriving on this world, and for the first time, it carried something more than survival, a faint freshness that lingered in his lungs, subtle but undeniable. He looked out across the landscape, following the paths of water as they moved steadily through the terrain, no longer fragile lines but forming channels, quiet beginnings of something that would continue long after. This moment passed, and he realized that he was no longer measuring time in minutes or miles, but in continuity, in what would remain. Behind him, she stood still, her presence no longer radiating outward but grounded, contained, as if whatever she had carried had now settled into the world itself. And when he turned to face her, there was a stillness between them that did not feel like distance, but like completion. "You are staying," he said quietly, not asking, and she nodded once, her expression calm, her eyes reflecting the soft light of a sky that no longer felt empty. "This place requires balance," she replied, her voice steady. "And balance requires presence." And Lucas let that settle, understanding not every detail, but enough to know that her role was not temporary, not something that would end when the rain did, but something that would continue, quietly, persistently. Just like the change around them, he glanced down at his hands, at the faint traces of moisture that still clung to the surface of his gloves, and for a moment, he remembered the weight of that single drop, the way it had felt in his hand, the way it had defined everything that followed, and he let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, but softer, more reflective. "All of this," he said, gesturing slightly toward the growing network of water, the darkened ground, the shifting horizon, "from one choice." And she looked at him with that same quiet certainty. "From one intention," she corrected gently, and Lucas nodded, accepting the difference, because now he understood. It had never been about the amount. It had been about the willingness. He turned back toward the horizon, scanning the distance where the desert still stretched, but no longer endlessly, no longer unchanging, and he felt something settle inside him, not a sense of ownership, not even responsibility, but connection, a recognition that he had been part of something that would continue without him, and that was enough. The rain continued its quiet fall, the streams carried it forward, and the world moved, not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily, and Lucas took one step forward, then another, his path no longer defined by escape or survival, but by presence, by the simple act of moving through a place that was no longer dead. Behind him, she remained, a constant within the changing landscape, her role as steady as the rhythm of the rain, and ahead of him, the terrain, opened, shaped by water, shaped by continuity, shaped by something that had begun with nothing more than a single act of giving. He did not look back again, not because it did not matter, but because he understood that it would remain, that what had been set in motion did not require his witness to continue. And as he walked, the sound of water followed him, quiet, persistent, a reminder not of what he had done, but of what it meant, and somewhere behind him, carried in the steady rhythm of falling rain, a single drop landed where his footprint had been, filling the space he left behind, not erasing it, but continuing it.